Hello, hello, writers. It's Mrs. SJ here. I am so glad that you all made it, especially considering I uh, just shared the link. So, for those who are just getting on, welcome, welcome. I gave about a minute and a half between the time I posted the link to starting the video. So, I'm glad that you guys made it. Today, we are going to continue our discussion of the nuts and bolts of writing a fantasy fiction short story. Now, today we're going to do two things. The first thing is look at our draft of writing. The second thing is we're going to discuss more specifically transition words and how transition words are really a supportive tool to use in your writing to help indicate the order in which things are happening in your story, to introduce either a thought process or talk about the timing. So go ahead and double check. The exit ticket in Google Classroom is recently posted. So it was posted about 5 minutes ago. Do not finish until you watch this entire piece. Okay, so really we have a lot of different things that you're going to be doing. The writing ticket, the exit ticket is going to be seeing what any creative transition words that you're going to be using. However, the first part of this is going to be discussing the story arc again and how we can really move step by step and in the writing process. So I wanted to go over that and show in my own example of my story that I'm writing and how this is going, how the story arc, moving from that, using that story arc as a foundation, how that's going to help me get a solid draft ready to turn in by tomorrow. If you came to morning meeting, you were updated that we are going to be turning in our completely fully polished draft, completely finalized, done on November 5th, which is a Thursday, so that we can have our literary salon celebration on Friday, November 6th. In between now and then, we have 2 weeks to take our draft in whatever shape it's in and really start zooming in on the details. So Tuesday's lesson was about quotation marks and knowing how to properly use quotation marks to indicate dialogue and lots of different types of dialogue, right? Whether it's someone saying something and then we find out who says it afterwards, or if someone says something, we find out who says it in the middle and then they continue saying something. There are lots of ways to include dialogue written in your story. So, just to remind us, right? Practice makes progress. Say it with me. Practice makes progress. We know that we are really taking time with this. You know, with any new thing that we're doing, because there are some of us who haven't written stories before, like a full-blown fantasy fiction story. Some of us have. And, depending on where you're at in the process, knowing that practicing with and working on something takes time to develop your craft. You're not going to be good right off the gate. It's like someone who picks up a paintbrush for the very first time and expects to paint like Monet. It's not going to happen. Similarly, if you are a skateboarder and you want to be an epic skateboarder like any famous skateboarder that you might know, I'm thinking of like Tony Hawk or, Jaws even, who's someone, a newer skateboarder of nowadays. They practice all the time. Practice makes progress. And I really like using skateboarders as an example of growth mindset because the best skateboarders fall down. The best skateboarders even fall down and make mistakes, and they have to get back up and try again. So even if you're sitting with your writing and you're like frustrated, it's not the way that you want it to, you're not going to give up. and say, I'm a terrible writer. I can't do this. I am not creative. I don't have all these great ideas because they're not coming to my head. And you give up, you're never going to write that story, right? So practice, even if that means like coming up with like 10 different ideas and then figuring out the one that sticks. So let me tell you what I mean by this idea of modeling the process of editing your work and not sitting with something that you don't like. So really, I wanted to bring our attention back to the story arc window. So give me a second as I pull this up. And that is not the one. Here we go. So I want to remind us of this story arc that we've seen. You know, we really took time. Let's see if I can zoom in a bit. I don't think it's letting me zoom in. Here we go. So to look at how our story begins, right? Say it with me. We have our starting point, which we also call the introduction. Some of us are calling it the prologue because you want to do some kind of introduction before you get into the conflict, or just rising action, as I like to call it. So after we have our introduction, we also have our rising action. This is so important because we really need to make sure that you are not only setting up what's happening in your book, but now the problem is coming up as well, right? So all stories, all good stories, good narratives, strong, developed, thought out narratives have a problem at its core. And if you have not figured out what your problem is, and there might be actually one problem that we learn about in the beginning that leads to the bigger problem, right? Which is going to be the climax. Oop, I'm going to have to pause that and move my thing around. So let's, oop, not that. Oy, yay, yay. So let's figure this out. Thank you for being patient with me. Oh, goodness. Zoom out. So we're getting to this point where once we have the conflict rises, we're starting to see that there's even more drama. So learning about how the conflict continues, and then moving from there to, not what I meant to do, to the climax. After the climax, we have a resolution. How does the story end? So this piece I want to go over is using my story as an example. And my story, so many of you might remember, and you could write in the chat, that I had a story that started with a girl who was in college in Boston, and it had to do with like a news organization. She wanted to be a broadcaster. That idea I threw out the window because I tried sitting and writing with it, and as much as it was a great idea that I liked, it wasn't what I was hoping for. And then one night, it was right after dinner, my husband and I were sitting on the couch with our two dogs. We all like to pile up on the couch, one big cuddle puddle. And we were sitting, and we like to kind of talk about our day at the end of the day. And I was telling him that I had this idea for a story, and I had another idea before this one. And then he said, well, I've been thinking of this idea for a movie. And so we started talking, and we started talking about, well, what if all of a sudden Mars exploded? And from there, we had this really fun kind of conversation that organically unfolded, and I was like, I got it. I've got my story. I know what I'm going to write about. And when this happened, I was getting like, I had like a bunch of ideas that popped up in my head at the same time. And many of you, you might have had a similar process where you were stuck with an idea or you didn't like it and it wasn't going so well. Well, that's a great time to ask for support because I was feeling stuck. And if I just sat around and was like, oh, well, I guess I'll just stick with this story that I don't really feel that crazy about, I'm not that excited about it, and, I'm not really feeling like it's sitting with me and the story that I want to tell, that wasn't going to be helpful for me as a writer. That would only make me feel like I'm not a good writer because I'm not feeling excited about the story. And that was when I started asking for help. So I started just kind of talking and saying, well, I want some ideas about, like what's happening or what I can talk about that happens, that I can also bring in certain elements of myself into the story. So I got help from my partner. I got help from a few other teachers and talking to some people and then looking up information online because I love learning about planets. And in my head, recently this came up for me, and because I'm seeing in the chat, like, can planets explode? Sounds like Mars is going through some tough times. That's right, Dermot. Poor Mars really is going through some tough times in my story. And planets do actually explode. And the way that this idea came about for me is that I was sitting outside because it was beautiful. And I don't know if you know this, but right now, Mars is the closest to Earth that it's been in many, many, many years. And in fact, it is so close that when you look up in the night sky, it is super big and super bright. And if you look in the eastern part of the sky, right after it gets dark, you might be able to see Mars. And the thought came up because my husband and I were playing like What If as a game. Like, what if we were sitting outside and all of a sudden you see Mars just explode in the sky? That would be wild, right? How many people would have like 1,000 questions immediately, right? How did it explode? Why? What? What does it sound like? What does it feel like on Earth when a planet explodes, even if that planet is a many 100 million miles away? So, and then this process of starting to brainstorm ideas, and absolutely, if you're like, ooh, I kind of like Mrs. SJ's idea, and I've been stuck on mine, then that is something that absolutely you can be inspired by other people's ideas. So what I did was, as soon as this idea popped into my head, I took elements of the story arc that was in, our, that's too small now, elements of our story arc that we had first started with, and then what I did was, I made myself headings. Oops. I made myself headings. So I have my introduction, I have my rising action, my rising conflict, my climax, and my resolution and conclusion. Now, the way that I start my writing process is with bullet points and getting ideas out there. And so I'm starting with, who is going to tell my story? Oftentimes we read books that the stories are told by a narrator, okay? A third person. And other books that we know are told by the person themselves, right? Consider when we read Island of the Blue Dolphins. The story is told in Karana's perspective. When we read Harry Potter, the story is told in a narrator perspective. Many of us have already figured out how you want to tell your story, who you want your story to be coming from. Do you want the story to be coming from someone who you don't want to introduce at the beginning at first, just an observer, right? And then I kind of start with like my idea of how I want the book to begin, right? So starts with waking up like any other day, looking around. That is when I'm going to do a lot of my show, not tell details of like introducing the setting. Look at that third bullet point. We learn about our main character's world. It's just like ours. It's slightly dystopian, just a little futuristic. Takes place in December of 2035. Finding a date can also be quite helpful because if you are like, I want to do something that takes place in the 1950s in the United States, well, you can do some fun research and find out, well, what was it like back then? What were the cars like? What kind of music did people listen to? And so those little details of pop culture can also be sprinkled in to your stories. But only if it adds to the story that you're trying to tell. Okay? So my introduction, I'm actually going to use a technique that I love and shout out to Quincy and Eloise when they had a prologue that started 50 years before the main story takes place. Well, I'm using a very similar kind of way where we're introduced to the world, and the very end of the chapter is when Mars explodes. And that's the problem in my story, is Mars is exploding. There is another problem that's revealed and will coincide with Mars exploding, but that isn't going to come until my climax. So then my rising action is going to be a rewind. So 1 month before the explosion takes place, I want to have a theme of waking up and having things kind of come up to people as they happen. And so, talking about ways that I'm bringing myself in, well, we're going to meet our main character again. And it's they're on a weekend, they're practicing for their in this instance, I'm going to call it a B'nai Mitzvah. And to indicate that, I want to tell a story where gender isn't necessarily the most important thing. And that's why I don't have a name yet for my character, but absolutely I am developing my character and how they are going to act when this disaster takes place. So I can see that some of us are like, your minds are racing and it's really exciting. Now is the time I want us to consider when we are going to be using transition words in our writing. And transition words for narrative writing can be really helpful, really, really, really helpful. Well, when we're talking about certain things, we have different transitions for different things, okay? So I have a couple things that I wanted to pull up so that we can go over when to use transition words, okay? But transition words are also linked to time and other really important things. So give me 1 second as I get this pulled up. Alrighty. So I have this awesome chart right here. It's called a narrative writing word map. And you should be able to see it now. It is a bit fuzzy, so we will go over it. Okay. Now, I love transition words because they can communicate a lot. Now, you may choose to take note, I'm going to say this is the time to take notes. You might have chosen to take notes earlier, but now I'm going to say this is when having something to write with is quite handy because this will be so helpful for you in your writing. Okay. Now, oftentimes when we use transition words to indicate time, it can be 1 day, early one morning, their eyes blinked and let in slivers of white light. The next day, one evening after that, soon, later, before long, moments later, now, meanwhile, finally. These are some transition words that will really be helpful in indicating the time that it happens. Of course, there's like after a while. Some time has passed. About a month earlier. Okay. Now, I love the senses and the tension that are in here. Even the figurative language. When we add figurative language, it really shows what is happening and not telling, okay? But looking at the adding tension, this is like to really make a clear, have a clear view of, okay, I want my reader to know how they're feeling. His voice dropped. Her hand started shaking as she reached for the door. Panic set in, right? From the shadows came out the person she did not want to see. So there are quite a few different things to do. Mainly, I want you to consider transition words that indicate time as a really great way to start with transition words. Now, we know transition words like first, second, next, then, finally, concluding, right? We know those. Now I'd like for us to really indicate the timing with transition words. So, on that note, that concludes our fantasy writing narrative lesson for today. I cannot wait to share my evolution of writing with you, and I cannot wait to see how your writing continues to evolve and grow as we continue to make progress. All right, Writing Group B, I will see you soon. If you're not in Writing Group B and you want to come on by. We're going to be doing some Quiet 10.